Welcome, it is Mitch. I'm on YouTube. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel as we try to build this thing up. Free agency right around the corner of the National Football League. Packers expected to be active. You kind of take a feel around the reports coming out of the NFL Combine in Indianapolis a week ago, and a lot of reports saying that teams are expecting Green Bay to be active. The three obvious needs that everyone has been discussing for them: wide receiver, cornerback, and pass rusher, getting another edge rusher, perhaps maybe more than one. See how Green Bay navigates that, whether it's free agency, trade, or the draft. The one market and this is the point of today's video, again, please subscribe if you haven't already. The one market Green Bay can't afford to wait out is wide receiver. And there's a few reasons why. And if you hadn't seen, and it depends on when you're watching this, but Wednesday, it was reported by Adam Schefter of ESPN that DK Metcalf of Seattle has requested a trade from the Seahawks. Seahawks already released Tyler Lockett, one of their most accomplished receivers in franchise history. Perhaps you could say, especially since 2000, their most accomplished receiver in the franchise. And so they released Lockett, and then Metcalf requested a trade. And I thought the interesting part within Adam Schefter's report was that he said the trade was requested by Metcalf after 2 weeks of discussions with the Seahawks. So Metcalf requesting this trade isn't catching Seattle off guard. It's not a surprise. They didn't find out, through Schefter and on Twitter. They had to be pretty, well aware that DK was going to make this public, that he was going to request a trade. I saw another report from NFL Network that said the Seahawks, will work with him to try to find him a new home if that's, the permanent route that both sides are going to take. I think the interesting part of this is obviously Green Bay was linked to Metcalf. There was a report from a Corbin Smith who works for a couple of outlets, different ones in Seattle or in the Seattle area, and he had reported that the Packers had actually made an offer to the Seahawks, and the Seahawks had a pretty high asking price of a first-round pick, which for Green Bay would be number 23 overall, and then one of Green Bay's young wide receivers. That report was debunked by a couple of reporters. Matt Schneidman of The Athletic, who covers the Packers, said no, there was no offer made. Seattle had leverage, though, because at that point, just a week ago at the Combine, DK hadn't requested a trade. And once, that is now made official, the team, whether you want to believe it or not, they lose a little bit of leverage because now it's made aware that the player wants out. Like Deebo Samuel with San Francisco. I'm sure San Francisco expected to get better than a fifth-round pick for Deebo at one point in time. But once, it was made clear he wants out and San Francisco's like, okay, we're going to grant his wish, you lose some leverage. Where the team can gain it back, and in Seattle's situation, is you hope to just spark up a bidding war. Like, hey, this team's offering this. You're going to have to go higher than that. And then hopefully you can gain some of that traction back if you're the Seahawks. But, today's price isn't tomorrow's price. And I think it'd be foolish to think that it would cost, Green Bay its first-round pick plus one of its own young wide receivers like a Dontavian Wicks, a Jaden Reed, Romeo Doubs, whoever. Obviously, Watson wouldn't be traded because he's injured. No one's going to trade for a guy who's going to miss a substantial part of the 2025 season recovering from a torn ACL. But the asking price will go down. I can't imagine it would cost a first and one of Green Bay's young wide receivers. So Seattle loses some of its leverage. The market, though, because Green Bay doesn't just need like a little push at wide receiver, in my opinion, right? Like there's certain areas where it's like, hey, could they upgrade the offensive line maybe on the interior, depending on what happens at center with Josh Myers? Like, sure, like it could use a little push on the interior of the offensive line. I brought up my concerns with the interior of the defensive line and how I think that needs to be a focal point as well. Kenny Clark had arguably his most down year in the NFL. TJ Slayton's a free agent. Devontae Wyatt has shown flashes, no consistency. He's been injured here and there. So yeah, but wide receiver doesn't just need a little nudge. Like, to me, the Packers need a bona fide number one wide receiver. They do. You went into 2024 thinking, okay, look at what these young wideouts showed in the second half of the season 2 years ago and in that playoff run, the win in Dallas, and then the game against San Francisco. The assumption was, man, out of Watson, Doubs, Reed, Wicks, someone's going to emerge as the number one in 2024. It just never happened. And so Green Bay, and they know this, Goody knows this, it can't just run it back and hope that in hopes that one of those guys does emerge this time around. Like, it'd be great if they did, but you can't bank in on that now after trying it and seeing it not come to fruition a year ago. And so the problem for Green Bay is, you'd love to get superstar talent across the board at all positions. It's not realistic. But there is a real need for a number one wide receiver to come into Green Bay. And when you look at the market, right now, DK Metcalf, he available to be traded, requested the trade from Seattle. Davante Adams, to me, you may differ on this opinion. To me, if you look at his numbers, his availability, he is still a true number one wide receiver, even though he's 32 years of age. His production has not dipped dramatically. He's missed a combined 4 games in the last 4 years. Davante Adams is still a true number one wide receiver. You look at some of the analytics, you look at his separation numbers, it's still almost as good as it gets with Davante Adams. After that, if you're talking about free agent, because remember, Deebo Samuel's gone. He's with Washington now. And Washington's taken on the salary, but they only had to give up a 5th-round pick. I don't view Deebo, I didn't view him as like a solution for Green Bay in terms of, hey, there's a superstar number one wide receiver. I feel like he probably would have been the best of the group in Green Bay, but there's consistency issues there, and of course you can use him in the ground game. Point being, you've got Metcalf, who's still with Seattle and would have to be traded. Davante is now a free agent after being released by the New York Jets. And folks, I'm telling you, like, after that, if you look, like, T. Higgins is back in Cincinnati on the franchise tag, 2nd year in a row. Outside of that, there's big name recognition, but it doesn't pack a punch like it once did. Stephon Diggs is a free agent. DeAndre Hopkins is a free agent. Keenan Allen's a free agent. Hollywood Brown's a free agent. Amari Cooper's a free agent. Like, name recognition, yes. Like, at one point in time, Amari Cooper was an incredible wide receiver. At one point in time in Houston, DeAndre Hopkins had a case to be a top 3 wide receiver in the league, maybe even a top 2 wide receiver. Stephon Diggs, at the peak of his powers, was a monster in Minnesota. Put up a couple of really damn good years in Buffalo. They are not the same as they once were. Diggs is 31, coming off a torn ACL when he was a secondary option behind Nico Collins in Houston. Even Tank Dell got just as much love before his injury, maybe more than Stephon Diggs. DeAndre Hopkins is 32 years old. He wasn't even a tertiary option in Kansas City, especially down the stretch run. Go look at DeAndre Hopkins' snap count totals as the weeks carried along in Kansas City. They went down. He saw less and less time on the field. Was pretty much a no factor in the playoffs for the Chiefs. Had a garbage time touchdown in the Super Bowl, and the game was already well over. Amari Cooper is going to be 31 in June. He had 20 receptions in 8 games after being traded to Buffalo. No factor in the playoffs. The alarming thing is you look at these receivers, and their numbers have been dwindling. The age is rising. There's injuries to a guy like Stephon Diggs. And you're like, well, what exactly are they working with? Amari Cooper's got Josh Allen throwing him the ball. Still couldn't produce. DeAndre Hopkins has Patrick freaking Mahomes throwing the ball. Still couldn't produce. Stephon Diggs had C.J. Stroud. Still couldn't produce. And, there's Keenan Allen's another name. I said he's 32. He was a number 1 for years with the Chargers. He was a clear number 2, far behind DJ Moore in the pecking order in Chicago. And so Green Bay needs a number 1. It can't afford to wait out the market. You can't go discount shopping at wide receiver this offseason for the Packers. And it's a front office that typically isn't going to show, it's not going to panic. And it's not a front office in Green Bay that is going to typically fork over more money or, in DK's case, more draft compensation than what it would like in a trade. But I really think if there's an exception to the rule, it would be this offseason, and there's money to be played with for Green Bay, and it can be chewed up quickly, but there's money to be played with, and there's a clear need at number 1 wide receiver. They don't need Stephon Diggs coming off a torn ACL. They don't need DeAndre Hopkins, who at 32 is clearly, I don't want to say a shell of the receiver he once was, but 32-year-old DeAndre Hopkins is not 32-year-old Davante Adams. Look at the numbers, look at the availability, look at the snap count totals, look at everything, right? 32-year-old Davante Adams is not 32-year-old Keenan Allen, who you can tell is really, he's not even on the back 9 of his career. He's on the green on 17, getting ready to tee off on 18. That's why the options are limited. Like, there's a need at corner for Green Bay. We all assume Jair Alexander is not going to be part of the equation, right? And there's a need at corner. By the way, it is Mitch. I'm on YouTube. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Always appreciate all the support. And so cornerback will have to be addressed, whether it's free agency, trade, draft, right? Those are your three avenues if you're Green Bay. But if you look at the free agent market at cornerback, you've got a lot of, first off, you have depth among the free agent class, and you have guys in their prime. Byron Murphy's in his prime. Charvarius Ward's in his prime. DJ Reed's in his prime. Asante Samuel Jr.'s in his prime. Those are all guys in their mid-20s, late 20s. And there's a lot of those names where the volume is there more consistently than what we're seeing with the wide receiver market of the names that are available. And so there's a need at corner for Green Bay. It'll have to figure it out. But there's a lot more quantity and quality in the cornerback free agent market than what we're seeing with wide receiver. If DK Metcalf gets traded somewhere and it's not Green Bay, and Davante Adams, some of the reports say he just wants to go back to the West Coast, or that would be his preference. Maybe he wants to follow Rodgers wherever he goes. Those options will be limited, we assume. Not too many teams looking for a starting quarterback right now that is, 41 years old? Just not happening. Like, I if he doesn't go to the New York Giants, I don't know. Stafford's back with the Rams. I don't know if he'd want to go to Tennessee because that roster needs a lot of help. So do the Giants, but at least you have neighbors in place, a front office that's trying to build an offensive line, a defense that has a couple of nice pieces, but different story for a different day. If Green Bay doesn't get a Metcalf, they don't get a Davante Adams, I don't know where you pivot to. And again, love Romeo Doubs, love Jaden Reed, love Dontavian Wicks. Watson's going to be out for a big chunk of 2025. Who feels good about the wide receiver room that struggled mightily to get separation down the stretch? Jordan Love had his fair share of struggles. There were also plenty of times where he didn't have a receiver getting open at all. Who would feel confident entering next, training camp, preseason, regular season with Doubs, Reed, Wicks, and then Hollywood Brown? Doubs, Reed, Wicks, and Stephon Diggs coming off an ACL. The other avenue they could take is the draft. But again, my hesitancy with that is Green Bay's picking at number 23. It doesn't need another young wide receiver with a high ceiling, an untapped potential, and a big upside. It just doesn't right now. I'd be happy if they took a wide receiver early. But let's say Luther Burden is available from Missouri at number 23. He's kind of slotted to go right around there. Luther Burden in 2 or 3 years might be a number one wide receiver in the NFL. Is he going to be that in his rookie season right out of the chute with wherever he lands? Probably not. That's what Green Bay's looking for, though. It's not looking for another young option that might develop, might flourish into a top option. It needs a top option now. Green Bay doesn't have a Jamar Chase, a Justin Jefferson, a CeeDee Lamb, a Brian Thomas out of Jacksonville. They don't have that. They don't have an A.J. Brown. They just don't. And to me, that's what's missing from this offense, because I like the offensive line. We love Josh Jacobs. Tucker Kraft's awesome. Hopefully Luke Musgrave has a bounce-back year. The one thing missing is, to me, an alpha number one wide receiver. And right now, with how the market's taking shape, DK Metcalf and, to me, Davante are those two options, because T. Higgins is off the board. Debo, if you consider him number one, I'm very fringe on that. He's gone. He's to Washington. And after DK and Davante, you're looking at, again, a list of Diggs, Hopkins, Keenan Allen, Cooper. Chris Godwin's an interesting name. He's 29. He's coming off a dislocated ankle. Suffered in week 8 a year ago. Most believe he'll be back in Tampa Bay. And until proven otherwise, I'm just going to assume he'll be a Buccaneer. He was leading the league in receptions at the time of his injury, but a dislocated ankle for a wide receiver coming back from that, and you expect him to pop right into wherever situation he lands at in week 1 and be a true number one. I don't know. There were times where it was like he and Mike Evans were a 1-1A duo in Tampa, but Evans has kind of always been the guy. So Godwin's another potential name, but again, I think it's slim pickings. It's DK or Davante, and if they go through the draft to do it, to me, it just doesn't solve the problem in the immediate. It adds another young piece to a young wide receiver room where nobody has taken the reins, where nobody has stepped up to be the number one guy in the group. And, I was part of the group that thought, hey, you know what? 2024, let's just see if one of these guys emerges. You can try to figure that out on the fly. And I liked the idea of, hey, they've got so many options. The defense has to prepare for not 1, 2, 3, but 4 really good weapons at wide receiver in the passing game, not to mention Tucker Kraft at tight end, Josh Jacobs in the ground game. And Josh Jacobs was a pretty damn good receiving back in 2024. So I was all for the idea. Last year I was not knocking at the door saying Green Bay needs a number one wide receiver. I thought one of the 4 main ones for Green Bay could potentially emerge. It just didn't happen, and I don't think you can run it back again. But the options outside of DK and Davante don't scream number one safety blanket for Jordan Love on a third down, a go-to option that a guy that can consistently get separation. And again, if you pivot towards the draft, you're just adding what you already have in abundance in the wide receiver room, which is a young option with a probable high ceiling, but very unproven. The potential still untapped, haven't quite reached the peak yet. And so that's why I don't think at 23 you're not, last year it was, hey, there's Marvin Harrison, there's Malik Neighbors. There's 2 guys, and Brian Thomas was that for Jacksonville too. But there were 2 guys where it was like, man, Marvin Harrison can go to Arizona and be the number one right away. And he had a pretty good rookie season. Malik Neighbors was sensational for the Giants. Like, I think after this upcoming year, we will genuinely be talking about Malik Neighbors in the same company or right around there as Jefferson, Chase, CeeDee Lamb, A.J. Brown, whoever else you want to throw into the mix. But when you're picking at 23 to try to get that number one guy that can slot in right away, it's a far-fetched idea. And so I don't think Green Bay has the luxury of being patient and waiting out this market. If you go with one of these options like a Diggs or a Hopkins or a Keenan Allen, or if you go through the draft to try to do it, to me, you're putting a Band-Aid on a wound that needs stitches. And so Brian Gutekunst used that word, urgency, at his end of the year presser. Said it's time this team starts competing for championships. Says there needs to be urgency. Urgency would be going out, not overpaying, not opening up the Brinks truck for Davante in free agency. But urgency would be going out there and saying, we need to make a run at DK. We need to try to get Davante back. Because outside of that, unless another name comes up on the trade market, that's a number one wide receiver. Green Bay, to me, they will not have solved that riddle. And so Green Bay, I believe it can show patience if it wants to. It doesn't have to. But it can show patience with the cornerback market. A lot of names, a lot of guys in their prime, a lot of quality, a lot of quantity. Pass rusher, a little bit different. We see Crosby go back to Las Vegas. That's one name off there. Don't know what Cleveland's going to do with Garrett. They don't want to trade him, but push comes to shove. Yeah. Is he even going to show up if Cleveland doesn't, meet his demands on a trade? And, Seattle's in a boat now with DK where if Seattle wants, they can say, tough sledding. You're coming back to Seattle. But he's only got 1 year on his contract left. Is Seattle willing to just let DK play out his contract and then let him walk instead of trading him now with 1 year left on his deal and getting something of quality back in terms of draft compensation? So I would expect DK to get traded at some point unless it's resolved with a massive contract extension in the form of Seattle forking that over to DK. But Green Bay doesn't. It'll be interesting to see how things take shape. Wide receiver, that word urgency with Goody. Wide receiver needs some urgency. Paid attention to it by the Packers. Because if DK and Davante end up not in Green Bay, and it to me, like, you just look at the odds, you look at the history, like, odds and history would suggest, like, both are going to end up somewhere else. Like, neither is going to end up in Green Bay. And if that's the case, I don't know what Green Bay has in terms of a number one wide receiver entering 2025. So we'll see. It is Mitch. I'm on YouTube. Always appreciate all the support. Please subscribe if you haven't already. We'll see you next time.